Hey everyone, welcome to the fourth part of this woodland base featuring Cult of Paint's very own Woodsman, and this part is maybe the most exciting. I don't know, depends what you find exciting, I guess. But we're going to be doing the water. I hope to show you a few really key tips on creating a great water base. I think it's quite difficult to create a barrier that's successful, and I've learnt a few really essential things along the way, so I want to share that with you. But as well as that kind of fault finding, I had a lot of issues with this base that I had to fix, and I think that's happened with every single water base I've done, is something has not gone super smooth. You know, you expect to make a barrier, pour the water, take it off when it's done, and for me personally, it's never really happened that way, and I'm going to try and show you some ways to avoid problems. I did have a few myself, but I did manage to resolve them, so I'll show you those too. And we're also going to do this fantastic blood drop effect, which I think is really cool, and some blood in the water. I think that's enough intro chat, so let's dive on into it. Just realised that's a pun, which wasn't intended, but I could have edited out and I've left it in, so you make of that what you will. So what are you going to need for your water? Well, first of all, the water itself is this Pebbio crystal resin. Now I get this from eBay, and there's a few different brands that make water. I know AK do it, but essentially you want a 2-part resin water product because that's going to give you something that doesn't climb, it's durable and perfectly transparent. There's other products for shallow puddles, and they don't work because they're a little bit rubbery at the end. They're good for some things, but when you want to do a deep pour, you need one of these. I believe it's an epoxy or something. Anyway, it's some chemical and it dries absolutely rock hard. So yeah, I always go for this Pebbio one, and it's really easy to get hold of. You're also going to need some thickish plasticard. I think this one is 2mm thick, and that's going to form the barrier. And then you're also going to need some acetate sheet. Do you remember overhead projectors? Really old school. It's the sheets that are used for use on those, and that is what's going to stop the resin sticking to your plasticard. So this is really, really essential. I did see a question before filming this tutorial, and they said the plasticard stuck to the resin and they couldn't remove it. And this acetate sheet is what you need. I don't know why, but it doesn't stick to the resin, and you should get some pretty smooth sides with it. I'm also going to recommend a hot glue gun. I've tried doing bases without this, and I have to say, with a hot glue gun, it's just so much better. It forms such a great seal and attaches it to your plinth, and also when you remove it, it doesn't even damage the paint. So hot glue gun is so essential. In fact, I would say that just by having acetate sheet and a hot glue gun, you're just going to encounter far fewer problems. If that's something you've not used before and you've tried water bases unsuccessfully, I would say these are the main ingredients you need. I also use some cotton wool, super glue, masking tape, slightly more regular things or more obvious things. And finally, I used a urethane-based pigment, which was very kindly provided to me by James Tarot from Tarot Model Maker. And this is what I used to make the blood underwater. I knew he had expertise in resins and casting, so I asked him what would be the best thing to create this effect I wanted to try. And he sent me a bunch of different products to try out, which I did test beforehand, which we'll go over. But these were really cool and obviously work really well with the resin we're using. So I will find a link for those where you can get hold of it if it's something you fancy. So the first thing we need to do is create the barrier. Make sure everything that's going to be underwater is painted and you're happy with it. Obviously you can't do any more painting, so just make sure you're done with that. So I'm basically going to cut my acetate sheet and my plasticard to create my barriers. If you're doing quite a shallow pour, like I did on my Hunter diorama. You can get away with just the acetate sheet because it will hold up, but when you're doing a deeper pour like I am here, you need the plasticard to basically support the acetate and make sure it doesn't move around too much. Because I'm doing a backdrop plinth, this made it slightly easier because I had one side done essentially. So I just needed to cut and shape it and make sure that my acetate and my plasticard would fit around all three sides. Obviously I need to make just two sides flush, and the front one can overhang either side on the corners. You can use super glue to attach your barrier to the plinth, but this means that you're guaranteed that you're going to have to sand it down after to remove that super glue. It's pretty likely you're going to have to sand it anyway. It's quite rare, I've found, that the water turns out perfectly, but if you're confident, then you don't need to use the super glue, and then you can just peel it off, and in theory it would be done. A big tip I found is don't make your barrier too deep. That's because if you get leaks, which again is quite likely, the shallower your barrier, the less it's going to leak down the side of the plinth. If you do a really big one that's kind of, the entire depth of the plinth, if it does leak, it will go all the way down there. Whereas I've kind of discovered I just need a few millimeters so it's secure to the plinth and it's not going to move and provide support, and that's enough. And that means if I do get a leak, there's going to be less sanding, which is definitely a good thing. The other thing that really helps against the leaks is, like I said, the hot glue gun. So I use a bit of tape just to hold it in place. Hot glue gun, one part in place, and once that's dry, remove the tape and obviously glue the other part of it. The awesome thing about the hot glue is if it does leak, as soon as it hits that, it's a perfect barrier. So it will not leak any further than the hot glue. And like I said, it's surprising how easily it is to remove. So I'm going to reinforce it. Hot glue gun is awesome for water bases, and I wish 5 or 6 years ago when I was first trying this, someone handed me a hot glue gun and it would have been way easier. I went completely over the top with the hot glue. It's just quite fun, really. Feels like arts and crafts. So yeah, I put way too much on, but can never be too safe. Another good tip I have at this point is make sure your barrier is as close to the perfect height as possible. I was a little bit quick and rushed mine, and I just did it a little bit too high, and what that means is the water will climb, whereas if you pour it perfectly to the right level, you obviously won't get it climbing the sides. Once you're happy with your barrier, then mix up the product. I don't really have anything to say there other than follow the instructions. I do advise that you use the mixing things provided, but pour both of those into a separate thing, and then as soon as you can, clean off those mixing, whatever they're called, because you're going to want to use them time and time again, and if you have some horrible sticky resin in, it's not great to use it. So you've got loads of working time with this resin, so I used to pour it in and then just really clean those measuring cups out. It's tough because you want to mix this really thoroughly, but you don't want to get air bubbles. I definitely mixed mine too fast, and I did have a few too many air bubbles. Like I said, you've got so much working time with this stuff, so you can kind of relax. It's not like mix it, pour it in straight away. You could actually mix it up and pour it in a couple hours later. It's over 24 hours to cure this stuff, so you can be quite chilled with it. I also advise using quite a lot of the resin, even if you're doing a small pour, because that gives you less room for error in getting that 2-to-1 ratio correct. I've got it slightly wrong before and it's not dried solid. If you want to be really sure that it's going to work, going to be sealed, then I would just paint a really thin layer, kind of like a varnish, over everything where it's going to go, and that will just seal it all in. I didn't do this and I didn't really have any problems, but I have done this quite a few times, but that would be a good way to start. But again, you've got to wait 24 hours for that to dry, so it depends how patient you are. When you're ready, it's the big brave step. Pour it in. And this is pretty fun actually. I love watching it move, and it looks like water straight away, obviously, and you kind of get an idea of how cool your base is going to look. I pour a little bit in, wait for it to level out, which takes quite a while, and then just gradually pour it in. That stops it from climbing too bad or going into the wrong places. But yeah, it's really good fun. I love doing this bit. And like I said, you've got a long time to work with it, so you can really let it settle into each area, make sure the level is correct, and just top it up. Pipettes are quite useful for this too, in small areas or parts you can't get to. Before doing this pour, I experimented with the urethane dye that James had given me, and I wanted to test a few things. Most of all, how much control would I have? Would it spread everywhere? Could I manipulate it? I just had no idea, and I also wanted to see what happened when it dried. So I poured a bunch of resin into these little cups and I just played around with it. I used an old airbrush needle so I could just slowly apply little bits, and I wanted to play with moving it around in different places and just seeing what I could do, and also work out how much I was going to need to put in. I knew I had one shot at getting this right, so experimenting was essential. I discovered a couple things while I was doing it. One was I was surprised how easy it was to manipulate, so I knew I could do a realistic-ish looking blood moving through the water, so that was really cool. But the other thing I worked out was the pale red one I'd used actually over time spread out way too far and actually wasn't suitable. But I did try another one which was much thicker, more intense. It was a lot darker, which I wasn't sure on, but actually I think in retrospect I do prefer this darker colour anyway. But this was a lot thicker. It was harder to manipulate how I wanted, but it did more or less stay in position. This stuff still spread, but nowhere near as much as that other one. So yeah, this is definitely the one to go for. And when I link to that product, this is the one I'm going to show you to go for. It did give me confidence because it wasn't as bad as I thought. You can put the blob in, move it about a bit, and then, you can't be mega precise with it, but I thought it was going to give me the desired effect. So I went back to my actual base and, we just went for it basically. I had a long pin coming down from the severed head to show me the exact position of where the blob was going to hit the water. This was more essential for the vertical drop I was going to add later, but it was still helpful to kind of get my point of entry. So I was quite cautious at first and just poked the needle in with a little bit of the colour on the top just to, make sure it was okay. Over time, I added a little more as I got more confident, and I started sort of spreading it out as I went. I wasn't sure how much of this I wanted, but after applying a little bit, relaxing for a bit, seeing it move around, I was quite confident and added a decent amount basically. Like I said, the working time for this is quite a long time, so you could kind of make a cup of tea, come back to it and add some more. In the end, it did spread maybe a little further than I imagined or would have liked, but I think it's okay. It actually spread out and there wasn't a really concentrated bit where I wanted, so I added a bit more. More is more, right? Maybe I should have held back, but in the end it worked out, so that was cool. But I kept fiddling with it basically because I was kind of like not 100% happy, but yeah, it's one of those things where you do have some control, but you can't control it perfectly, so you just have to give it a go and let it be, I think. Looking at it from the top and actually looking back at this footage as I talk over the top of it, it definitely looks convincing. I think that is a cool blood effect in the water. Yeah, so I would say that is a successful experiment. So now you need to be patient because it does take at least 24 hours for this to dry. I actually left it for 2 days because I didn't really have time to work on it anyway with work and everything. So after a couple days, I came back and peeled off all that hot glue, which is super satisfying, and I was excited to see what it looked like underneath. So you can see the acetate sheet makes it pretty easy to pull off, and you do get perfectly glossy, smooth sides. This point is where you're going to see your leaks, and you can see I had a little bit leaked down and it stopped as soon as it hit that hot glue gun, which is exactly why I said don't do your barrier too deep, because we're going to have to sand all that off, I think. Again, we peel off the sides, and as you can see they come off pretty easily, and you do get a very nice, transparent, super smooth side. I do have a little bit of a weird gooey line on the front, which you'll see in a minute I do have to resolve, but as far as things go, that's a pretty good result. I do have to tweak it to make it perfect, but not bad. I'm quite happy with that. So as you can see, I got a pretty good result. I got quite a lot of climbing, and that's because I didn't make the height of my barrier accurate enough. And yeah, just a few little imperfections on the sides, so I'm definitely going to sand it off. You can see the kind of weird bit at the front going on, and I thought I just needed to sand that away. It turns out it was actually some resin that wasn't quite cured enough. No idea why it happened, and of course it would have to be on the front, the main view, not like the back of the side or something like that. The cool thing about this resin is you can sand it starting with quite rough sandpaper. I started with 400 grit, and you can polish it up and get it completely transparent again. So if you do make mistakes and it's not quite perfect, you can basically finish it in this way and get it perfectly flush to the sides of your plinth. So I began sanding mine up, going through the different grits, something like 400, 800, 1000 and so on. You can go all the way up to 3000, and then past then, probably not really worth it. You can see on mine I start to encounter this problem where there's just a soft layer of resin, and I don't really know how that's happened. If I'd have sealed it, maybe I wouldn't have come across this problem. Anyway, I had to resolve it, and I was nice and calm for once, so maybe that's a sign of me getting older. I'm a bit calmer when these things happen to my miniatures. But I had to scrape it out with a knife, which was just not a nice feeling because I was so happy with this base so far. So I was determined to fix it and make it work, but I was like, ugh, I wish this just went smoothly. I then turned it on its side, mixed up some of the resin fresh, and as you can see, I just used a brush to get it in there and hopefully seal this gap and the problem would go away. I used an old brush, obviously, but if you clean it straight away, it'll be fine. You can get that resin off, just be careful, you know. Luckily, this fixed my problem, and you could still see a tiny line, but I knew it was there and I don't think anyone else would notice. So I wish it had gone perfectly because I can still see it, but I did save it, so I felt kind of grateful that it was okay. So I went through that whole sanding process again and I polished it up as best I could. When you have finished polishing it, it's still not going to look perfectly transparent. It will be a little bit cloudy. And I use this product called Glass Coat, which is kind of self-explanatory really. I think it's used for repairing plane canopies, you know, when you get the little transparent bits with model kits. So it's really good for this sort of thing. So try and sand it as best you can, and then just give it a nice thin coat of this stuff, and it should come out looking pretty perfect. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the bit I was probably looking forward to the most, because I'd done this before and I knew I could pull it off basically. I wasn't worried about it, whereas all the other water stuff, as you can see, you know, bits have already gone wrong. So I was just glad to get to this point and I knew it'd be more enjoyable. You might have seen my previous tutorial where I did a splash effect where the hunter was running through the water, and I was super happy with this effect. and this was a much simpler version of this. So to make those splashes, I got some cotton wool and I actually spread this across some lids I had lying around, and then I get the same resin I use for the water, and you're trying to kind of catch small fibers that you've spread across, and you let it dry and you basically get left behind with these awesome little drips and things like that. I actually made these months ago when I did the previous base, so I kept all the little castings I made before and I just went through looking for one that would be suitable for my blood drop. There's probably a bunch of different ways you can achieve this same effect, but I like the cotton wool way because you get really thin fibers, you get these perfectly transparent little blobs, and because you've used this resin, they're absolutely rock hard. So they do look fragile, and of course you can break them, but they're sturdier than you think. And like I said, they're absolutely rock solid using that resin, so it's really easy to get this nice vertical effect. Once I had the right one picked out, I actually just got a bit of blood for the blood god and painted it over to get the colour right. It's actually a really great product, I think. There's loads of other ways to do blood, but this one's so easy and it just works. I think maybe I could have used the urethane dye and mixed that with some of the resin so it matched the blood underneath perfectly, but I knew this would be okay, so this worked for now. I worked out the exact position that I needed to go in based off of that pin I had off the severed head, and I just put a tiny bit of super glue and put it in position. I actually drilled a little hole before, and that meant it would be a bit more sturdy, I think, so just allowing it to go a little bit lower. Once this was in place, I actually mixed up some new resin, and remember I said I had some climbing up the sides? What you can do to get rid of that is do a thin pour on the top, and that will meet those climbing sides and it will get rid of them. This would also have the added effect, it would give a nice solid base to my blood drop, and everything would be nice and solid then. So at this point everything is looking pretty cool. The sides are nice and flush, we've got the blood drip that's done, we've got the blood moving through the water, so it's all looking really cool. Actually, it's quite painful for me to watch these clips back and do the audio because I did make a slight mistake and it looked better at this point, but you'll see later on. So I kind of wish I'd left it here, but I did think I would have to add some ripples and some movement in the water from where the drop had actually hit it. So I use a product called Water Texture from Vallejo, and it's absolutely fantastic. I really like it, and I've had a lot of success with it in the past. This is actually where it went wrong for me, but I'll talk about why in a little while. So I used this to create the ripples, and I actually used a clay shaper, which is really good for sculpting with putty, and I found this really nice to create nice ripples with a bit of movement in them. In retrospect, I think I made these ripples a little bit too bumpy, and I would like to do smoother, more subtle ones. So the only issue with water texture is it is not as transparent as the crystal resin, so it's just not as perfect, and as you turn it you can see it's a slight different finish, and I really wanted to be able to see the blood from underneath. So what I do is get some of the crystal resin and just paint that over the top like a varnish, and I had loads of success when I did this for my hunter base. It came out perfectly because I had some subtle ripples and I had the sort of more interesting ones closer to it, and the crystal resin softens it as well as making it really shiny and really transparent. For some really weird reason it went slightly misty on me, so it was all looking pretty cool, but when the crystal resin had dried, I got this kind of misty, slightly white look to where I'd put the water texture, and this didn't do it before, so I just repeated the same thing, but this time I got this mist, so I'm not sure I can recommend doing it this way in case you get that problem. I was pretty gutted, to be honest, because there's basically no turning back. and it's not a real problem. It still looks good, but it doesn't look perfect, and I was so happy with this base so far. I always think that's quite annoying to get those sorts of things. If I could go back in time, I would just make ripples using the crystal resin. So I would wait for it to partially dry so it was a little less runny, and I would paint some circles around the drip, and eventually those would soften out and create very mellow and subtle, but probably enough for ripples, and you'd still be able to see that blood perfectly through it. I mean, the drop looks cool. From the side you can still see the blood, and it looks good in natural light actually. It's only when I look under my desk lamp that you can see the slight misting, so it's really a minor thing, but I'm still a little bit heartbroken anyway. I think this kind of, it's done now and the base still looks good, so it's a lesson learned for me, and I wish it was perfect, but it's just the way it goes sometimes. I think at least from the photographing angle, it's still going to look spot on because you're not going to be able to see that misting. Like I said, you can see the blood through the side. The drip looks awesome, and overall I think the base is still going to be fantastic, but I just loved looking at it from above and seeing that blood. You can see where I've left it transparent over the stones. It looks awesome, and it's just a tiny bit harder to see through in that kind of blood area, but hey ho, I still think it's cool overall, and maybe in a few weeks time I'll get over it and I won't feel so bad. I guess it's just annoying because I did the same steps I did for the wolf and that turned out absolutely grand, but now I've learnt this, then I probably won't do that in the future. And like I said, I think I would do ripples with just the crystal resin. So you're mixing up the crystal resin quite a few times in a few stages, but ultimately it's worth it to get an amazing effect. I think perhaps in a future tutorial I will try and conquer how to make these ripples. I've actually done them before where I sculpt them with putty and then create a mold and cast the ripples, but that is a very labor intensive kind of procedure, so I will research and try and come up with the nicest way to make really great ripples. I just finish off the sides with another coat of the glass coat, and that is actually everything for the water effects complete. So I know we sort of ended on not a high note there talking about the mistake I made, but overall I'm really happy with how it looks. At the end of the day, I was experimenting too, so the blood experiment came out really well and then another one didn't. But I hope that you guys have really enjoyed it and have picked up a load of interesting things to try. And I also hope that I've given you some ideas or some essentials for doing water effect bases in general. So if you do any water effect base, hot glue gun, acetate sheet, that is the key. So I hope you've got that out of it if that's something you didn't know before. I'm really looking forward to hearing your comments about this base and the water effects, so yeah, feel free to just tell me stuff and let me know what you think. And if you do any water bases yourself, please tag us in it. We would love to see if this tutorial has given you some confidence to give it a go. It is really good fun. I want to do another water base again really soon because I just love the way that transparent resin looks every single time. That concludes the final part for the base itself, and next we're going to go on and paint the miniature, and I really hope the end product with the miniature glued on is going to be something special. I think it's going to be special for me anyway. There's a few little things I'll probably tidy up on the base, and I'll include that in the final part where I stick the model on and tidy it all up. But I've really enjoyed this 4-part series on the base on its own, and I hope you have too. And yeah, I hope you're looking forward to seeing how the figure is painted and just what the project finishes up like. Once again, any comments, would love to hear from you, and looking forward to starting that figure. See you next time.